This video is sponsored by Stamps.com. To have all your mailing and shipping covered this holiday season without any long-term commitments or contracts, simply go to Stamps.com/companyman for a special offer that includes a 4-week trial, free postage, and a digital scale. The link is in the description. I have made exactly 350 videos on this channel talking about various companies and brands in all different areas of business. However, oddly enough, I have yet to make one about an auto manufacturer, so I figured that a great place to start would be with Volkswagen, given that they are among the biggest, most controversial car makers in the world. Literally, based on sales, they are the biggest. In 2016, they sold 10.3 million vehicles, just slightly more than Toyota for the first time, and as of 2022, continue to outsell all of the others. Almost $300 billion in annual sales makes them not only the highest selling company in Germany, where they're headquartered, but also, according to Fortune, the 15th largest company in the world. Now, I do need to point out that those sales are not just from VW branded cars, because Volkswagen is the owner of multiple other brands that you may not even realize. In 1965, they famously acquired Audi and have been the owner of it ever since. In 1998, they acquired Bentley and Lamborghini in separate deals, and in an unusual failed takeover situation, they were able to acquire full ownership of Porsche in 2012. I only mention all of this so you can better understand the full extent of this company and the scale of these controversies. Volkswagen has roots going back over 80 years, and over that time, they have been criticized at various points for more expected scandals involving things like bribery or product recalls, which are still very serious. But for this video, I want to look at some of the more unusual, troubling aspects that I think are particularly interesting and maybe even important to talk about, and I think you will feel the same way. Starting off at the beginning of the company, when it was originated in Nazi Germany. Clearly, this is going to be a heavy subject because Volkswagen was founded by the German government, who at the time was controlled by Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. In the 1930s, automobiles in Germany were mostly considered a luxury item that were too expensive for the average citizen to afford. Something like 2% of the population owned one at the time. Hitler wanted to produce a more affordable car that the people of Germany could use to get around because he felt that it would ultimately lead to growth and happiness throughout the country. To realize that vision, he brought in respected auto engineer Ferdinand Porsche to design it, built a large plant to produce it, and established the company that later became known as Volkswagen. In fact, the word Volkswagen translates to people's car. The government was offering a special savings plan and working hard to get the people of Germany inside one of these cars. Well, that never happened. The plan never really got off the ground because World War II started and all of the plant's production was shifted toward the war effort. They were exclusively making vehicles and other equipment for the German military, and unfortunately, as you might expect, there were some terrible things happening at that factory. I just don't want to go into too many details here, but at one point, the majority of people working there were essentially slaves, mainly Soviet POWs or Jewish individuals brought in from concentration camps. They opened these nursery facilities that would often separate newborn babies from their mothers and then neglect those babies. Alright, I'm gonna move on from this, but those were the early days of Volkswagen, fully acknowledged by the company, by the way. In the 1980s, they commissioned a 1,000-page book that highlighted everything that was happening at the factory during that time. It was released a decade later and followed by a $12 million fund intended to compensate the estimated 1,000 to 2,000 surviving slave laborers that were forced to work there. By the end of the war, the factory had been heavily bombed by Allied forces, but was actually restored by them after the war. The British took it over, rebuilt it, and within just a few years did a great job in reviving the German auto industry. By 1949, when the majority of passenger cars in the country were being made by Volkswagen, control of the company was shifted over to the West German government, who 21 years later sold 60% of the company's stock to the public, effectively ending any government control of it for the first time. Out of those 350 videos on this channel, this has to be the most disturbing origin story among them. I mean, even though control was shifted and major positive changes were made at Volkswagen, they still had a terrible reputation to overcome. In 1950, when they started selling cars in the United States, almost nobody wanted them. Even aside from the hesitation from the former Nazi affiliation, they were smaller than most of the other cars and people thought that they were funny looking. After their first year in the US, something like 0.005% 90% of new cars on the road were made by Volkswagen. It was literally like a few hundred cars, but they were surprisingly able to break into the market. A lot of the credit goes to an advertising campaign that started in the late 1950s that not only started calling the car a Beetle, but effectively spun those perceived negatives into positives. Slogans like "Think small" made people stop and consider that maybe a small car is actually better. Plus, in the 1960s, it became cool to go against the standard. There was this whole counterculture movement, so the fact that Volkswagen stood out so much from the other car makers really started to work to its advantage. The Volkswagen bus, for example, became popular among hippies or anyone trying to separate themselves from the norm or protest the establishment. You get what I'm saying here. Meanwhile, the Beetle became the world's best-selling car. By 1972, they had sold over 15 million of them worldwide over the years, surpassing the record set by Ford's Model T in the 1920s. The Beetle was quickly becoming unpopular during that time, but VW was able to revive themselves by introducing more traditional, sportier models like the Golf in 1974. Unlike the Beetle, the engine was in the front, it had front-wheel drive, not to mention the design changes like the hatchback. By the 1990s, Volkswagen was still selling a lot of cars, but having trouble making money from those sales. In short, profits were down, so logically, they were looking to reduce expenses, and they thought that they had the perfect plan to make that happen. It leads me to the next reason on my list: espionage. I love using that word, and I'll admit, this is clearly not as severe as the other two on my list, but it is still troubling and, in my opinion, a crazy story. Ignacio Lopez had a reputation in the automotive industry as being like a wizard when it came to negotiating with suppliers. He would get them to accept lower payments and agree to more favorable terms and just cut these deals that no one else seemed to be able to. In the early 1990s, he had worked for General Motors, where he had revolutionized their purchasing operations in North America, helping recover their profits by literally saving them billions of dollars. You might see where this is going, but Volkswagen's plan to recover their profits was to simply hire Lopez and the rest of his team away from General Motors. Here's where things get sketchy. When he made the transition, General Motors claimed that Lopez stole confidential documents and brought them over to Volkswagen, essentially leaking company secrets to a competitor. And I'm talking about a lot of company secrets. 20 boxes worth of documents containing data about supplier costs, a new car that they were working on, even plans for a new factory. GM sued Volkswagen over it, and it kind of evolved into a feud between two of the world's biggest automakers. It ended in 1997 when Volkswagen agreed to pay $100 million to GM, qualifying for one of the largest settlements ever in a corporate espionage case. I should make it clear that Volkswagen never admitted to any kind of wrongdoing, but this is a sketchy situation to say the least. The following year, Volkswagen was revitalized a bit by the purchase of those luxury car brands and by the US introduction of the new Beetle, helping increase their market share by 2.5%. By the way, I think it's interesting that the Beetle was continually produced in one form or another somewhere in the world all the way until 2019, when they discontinued it in favor of making electric vehicles, mostly in the form of SUVs and crossovers. To finish up my list, I have to talk about their infamous emission scandals, sometimes referred to as Dieselgate, or less commonly, the Diesel dupe. It is yet another troubling part of their history. In 2014, a study at West Virginia University showed that diesel cars made by Volkswagen were polluting way more on the road than in actual emissions tests. That's concerning, right? Why would the cars be passing the test and then polluting the air to a degree that is much higher than is allowed to pass the test? That doesn't make any sense. Well, it turns out that Volkswagen was intentionally deceiving these tests. They put a device inside the car that could tell when it was being tested, so it can go into some kind of a low power type mode and then switch back out of it after the test when it was back on the road. They admitted to installing these devices in 11 million diesel powered vehicles throughout the world, 500,000 of which were sold in the United States. They were doing this over the course of 6 years through many of their most popular models, including the Beetle, the Golf, the Jetta, even the Audi A3 was affected. They were violating the Clean Air Act in the United States, considering that some of these vehicles were producing 40 times the legal amount of pollutants. In 2017, Volkswagen pled guilty to criminal charges and agreed to pay $4.3 billion in fines and penalties, and that was in addition to $14.7 billion that they paid to settle civil lawsuits in the US from the people who bought these cars. Oh my goodness. In the end, Volkswagen estimates that they paid almost $35 billion in fees and settlements related to the scandal, making it one of the most costly and corporate history. Their stock price fell, their CEO resigned, their head of emissions compliance in the US was sentenced to 84 months in prison, and they later stopped making diesel vehicles in the US altogether. I know this sounds really bad, but despite the severity of the situation, the financial setback, and the obvious negative publicity generated from it, I wouldn't say Dieselgate was all that harmful to the company. If you remember from the beginning of the video, they claimed the title of the biggest automaker in the world during all the craziness from the scandal, and have continued to raise their sales since. When you take a step back to look at this, it's pretty wild that a company with so many troubling aspects throughout their history can continue to move forward and even lead their industry. I don't know if that's unsettling or motivational in an odd way. I guess it depends on how you look at it, but it is an unusual story, and I can't imagine that the world will ever see another company quite like Volkswagen. Let me know in the comments, do you agree that this was a good choice for the first automaker to cover on this channel? There are plenty of good ones to cover in the future from different angles, but I don't know, Volkswagen just has a way of standing out from all of those others. Sometimes that has been a good thing, while other times it has been bad, and I'm hoping that this video was able to give an overall picture and show both sides of it. And finally, what do you think of the vehicles themselves? If you own something that was made by Volkswagen, what is your review of it? Are you a loyal customer of theirs, or maybe you choose to stay away? And any other thoughts you have about Volkswagen, leave them in the comments. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Stamps.com is the sponsor of today's video, or as I call them, my one-stop shop for all of my shipping and mailing needs. Seriously, I have not been anywhere near a post office all year because I have been printing postage from the comfort of my home using only a computer and a printer. There are no lines, no traffic, no waiting. It's amazing, especially when you factor in the huge carrier discounts up to 84% off USPS and UPS. And for any business owners out there, this is the perfect time to get started. I'm sure you know that the holidays are going to get stressful. You may already be experiencing it. It's a great time, but it is busy, so I recommend using Stamps.com to make things easier. For 25 years, they have been indispensable for over 1 million businesses. It's a great service, and to get started, all you have to do is go to Stamps.com/companyman to receive a 4-week trial, free postage, and a free digital scale. Click the link that is in the description. Happy holidays, and thank you for watching.